Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to have been asked to introduce Adele Vranach this morning, and I would like to thank Mary Condren for the invitation to chair this talk. Adele has been a former colleague and friend over many years. She has spent her life working on early medieval Ireland. She is currently adjunct professor in the School of History, University College Cork. And this is merely the latest in a series of important positions she has held, and in each her contribution has been outstanding. Her publications are too numerous to list. I would mention in particular her sterling work with the Discovery Programme over many years, laying the foundations for the literary and historical exploration of the site of Tara. This led to her editing and contributing to a collection of essays entitled The Kingship and Landscape of Tara. With other scholars, she edited another collection entitled Landscapes of Cult and Kingship, Kingship and Religion, Landscape, Kingship and Religion, published by Four Courts Press in 2014. And we are waiting in anticipation of her next book, tentatively entitled Monasticism in Ireland, AD 900 to 1250, to be published next year by Four Courts. Adele's work has placed emphasis upon a number of points. The importance of archaeological and linguistic evidence, the importance of reading the sources in their own contexts, the importance of noting that the Christianization of Ireland did not happen overnight. And we should not forget that Bridget lived during this time. With these points in mind, we look forward to her insights in her talk entitled Bridget and Kildare. Adele.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Charlie Doherty, who I should say was my first mentor in the subject and has been an inspiration to me all through my career. Also, thank you very much to Mary Condren and to Women's Spirit Ireland and to Catherine, the Director of Gender and Women's Studies here in Trinity. I suppose Bridget has been sort of straddling all through my life, really, in that when I was young, my parents used to bring us to Kildare, which holds a piece of, well, so-called, reputedly, Bridget's skull, which was brought in 1929 to Kildare for the dedication of the church there from Lisbon. Unfortunately, the very beautiful Celtic designed reliquary was stolen in 2012, but happily the relic itself has survived. Now, my memory of Kildare is of Gava Multa Bridget, a song that I learnt at school, and also of a very windswept and moaning family as they were brought to Kildare every year in effectively midwinter. So, and my own sister, of course, is Breed, as so many families have siblings or included Breed or Bridget as a personal name. So she has been with me a long time. Anyway, what I'm looking at today is to look at the sources, the original sources, both historical and archaeological, and to read them, as Charlie says, in their own context and what they are telling us about Bridget. And also to look at the archaeology of Kildare and its environs. And I'll come to that towards the end, because I think we have a very important background to Bridget and her people in that area. So, how do we know about Bridget's life and her miracles? Well, like everything in early Irish history, we have a wonderful set of annals. Annals are chronicles that record year by year. They really started, they are an international, a lot of chronicles and Christian chronicles tell, for example, the death of popes or of emperors. In Ireland, we seem to have the beginning of chronicle writing, at least we know of, in the 6th century. And so she appears in sets of annals. We have lives of her, both in Latin and in Irish, from a very early stage, and literally hundreds of manuscripts in Britain, less so in Ireland because of the historical movement of our manuscripts and loss of manuscripts, but on the continent, in France and in Germany. And the reason is because she became really popular from a very early stage. In Ireland, we are really lucky to have sets of genealogies going right back, probably written or recorded in writing from at least the 6th and definitely the 7th century. And she, of course, and her people appear in the genealogies. We have hymns in Irish and in Latin dedicated to her. We have her mentioned in martyrologies, in other words, lists of saints to be commemorated on a particular feast day. And of course, she turns up in the martyrologies, the Irish martyrologies being the earliest one, the Féile Aonghasa, and the martyrology of Tala. So of course, she turns up on the 1st of February there. And of course, as we all know, there are Kilbrides all over Ireland. There are Kilbrides in Scotland. She is remembered in places like Brideswell, St. Brides, and so on in Britain. And this is a very complex kind of network to understand why we have so many of these places named after Bridget. So as Charlie said, the main thing from my perspective is that we understand these texts in their own historical, religious, and societal context. So that is a fundamental of my paper today. So we start with the Annals. A chronicle probably compiled very early on in Latin, possibly even by St. Columba. Dan McCarthy, who was in Trinity for years and years and is the expert on this subject of the structure and creation of the Annals, suggests, yes, the dates of her birth as a person, 439, and death at 524, are quite possible. And if this chronicle was compiled by St. Columba, who dies in the late 6th century, so around 597, well, then she would have been in the historical memory just a generation earlier. And variations of all these dates occur in our main annals, the Annals of Tiernach, the Annals of Ulster, Inishfallen, and Clonmacnoise. So she definitely, from the point of view of the annals, the recording of people in Ireland in the early period, is regarded as a historic figure with actually possible historic dates. So some say she died at 86, some say she died at the age of 70. So now we come to the lives and the manuscripts. We have the Latin life of St. Bridget by a man called Cogitosus. We don't know who he is. We can guess he's associated with Kildare, as I'll show you. And there are various dates given to his life, the written life, mainly 650, 680, where you have an explosion of hagiography, or lives of saints, particularly Patrick and Bridget, and obviously the great life of Columba by Odofnan, the 9th abbot of Iona. So there is this great explosion, mainly in Latin, and we scholars endlessly debate the dates, relative dates of all these lives. We have another life in Latin, the Vita Prima, or the first life. Again, possibly contemporary, some argue earlier, some argue later than Cogitosus, but quite a different type of life, as I'll show you. We've got the Bethevrichte, which is in Old Irish, and is possibly dated to the 8th century, and related to the Vita Prima. We know that at an earlier generation to Cogitosus, others had compiled information about St. Bridget. So, for example, Ultan of Ardbraccan in County Meath is mentioned as writing lives of Patrick and Bridget. Aileron of Clonard is said to have written a life of Bridget. So it is based on earlier material. And as I said, the manuscripts come from all over, hundreds of them. Belgium, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. Libraries in these countries hold versions of the life of St. Bridget. And I think I have one here, yes. This is the Vita Prima from the British Library, which is one of the earliest manuscripts with the life of Bridget. A very beautiful manuscript, not at all illuminated, but with a very clear, nice hand of the Vita Prima. Now we come to what are they saying? So Cogitosus, who was he, and why did he write a life of St. Bridget? Well, as I said, we don't know the seed breeding generation of Cogitosus. The name itself is somewhat, we're not quite sure where he got it from. It doesn't appear as a word, but it must be to do with cogito, being a smart lad, knowing things, thinking. It may be some form of translation of an Irish personal name, but we don't know about him, except that he is called my father by a Murchu who wrote the life of St. Patrick. I don't think it means my father in sense of blood relation, but presumably as a scholarly pupil-master relationship. To the forefront of Cogitosus's life are the interests of the Church of Kildare. And he makes that clear in his prologue. So he says, thus, from then on, the anointed head and primate of all bishops and the most blessed chief abbess of the virgins governed their primatial church by means of a mutually happy alliance and by the rudder of all virtues. By the merit of both, their episcopal and conventual see spread on all sides like a fruitful vine with its growing branches, and struck root in the whole island of Ireland. It has always been ruled over in happy succession, according to a perpetual right, by the Archbishop of the Bishops of Ireland and the Abbess, whom all the abbesses of the Irish revere. Now, there are some extremely important messages in that prologue. First of all, we are seeing probably this, an echo of the struggle for preeminence in Ireland between the Church of Armagh and Kildare. Of course, Armagh in the end, and Patrick wins out. And there is in the Vita Prima a very important description of Patrick and Bridget in conversation, fairly equally. You know, Patrick, for all his heroics in the Latin lives, gives her space. Although, interestingly, Cogitosus does not mention Patrick. We are in the background in the 7th century of this huge controversy, which we call the Easter controversy, which is to do with the calendar of when Easter falls. And, you know, it's a very big controversy that really swallows up the Irish Church during this period. And it seems that Armagh sort of lagged behind, possibly Kildare, but that may be because Kildare was in Leinster. Kildare had a lot of influences coming in, and the southern, as they call the southern church, tended to go with the papacy on the Easter controversy. And there's an element of orthodoxy, being acceptable, and this is very much shown in the references to the the Archbishop of all bishops, and also the revered abbess. Because Kildare from the beginning is what we call an episcopal church. So it's a church with a bishop and an abbess. And this is very much a model that you find all through late antique Western Christendom. So it's probably a model that is not quite the same as Armagh, but most likely to be this type of model. And it also is very significant that she is called the abbess of all abbesses, because this is very significant for early Christian female foundations. We have lots, as you know yourselves, of foundations or churches, wells, all sorts, with female saints, female cults. I come from Dalkey in County Dublin, and the saint there is Saint Becknard. And what you have, and Killiney, the saint of the daughters of Lénine. So they're all over the place. And what you find there is probably families handing their daughters over to this new vibrant church, giving them land, founding a church. But many of them don't then flourish like Kildare into monasteries. Very, very few of them do, in fact. And what happens is that you tend to have the woman's name commemorated and surviving, and then they become small family churches, and very much attached to the original family, the kin of the woman who was the founder. So Kildare begins at this stage to sweep them up, and there's a wonderful list of these churches, very long list, which says that they are subject to Bridget. So they become small churches under the I suppose, jurisdiction of St. Bridget. Now you have the same happening with Glendalough, where Kevin and Glendalough sweep up other churches in Leinster. So, but this is a female foundation, so it's very significant from that point of view. Now, how does Cogitosus portray Bridget? Well, he doesn't give much away as to biographical details. His whole kind of raison d'etre or reason for writing this life is to show the orthodoxy of the church at Kildare, the authority of bishops. For example, Conlace, who Bridget picks, chooses to be her her co-governor, her co-ruler of Kildare. Macaulay, who is the person who gives her the veil. And you can see in it the fervour of an early first Christian generation. And we have to remember what Charlie said, you know, Christianity doesn't sort of whoop in to Ireland with St. Patrick and then be accepted. You have a long process. It probably seeped in from the 4th century onwards and continued to develop until it was fully accepted. Well, fully accepted at a certain level by the 7th century. So we have an example of this orthodoxy and again this link with the late antique church as things were evolving, because we always think that Ireland is behind in all this. It is not. All these things are happening around in Britain, on the continent. And Ireland is as much at the same time doing the same. So this idea that we lag behind is just not so in early medieval Ireland. So there's a lovely description in Cogitosus of what we call the velatio, or the veiling, where Macaulay, Bridget wants to become a nun, counter to her parents' wishes, who want to marry her off. And it is the exact description you find of what a velatio is. Shortly afterwards, when her parents wanted to betroth her to a man according to the custom of the world, which was the normal customs of such families, Bridget, inspired from above and wanting to devote herself as a chaste virgin to God, went to the Most Holy Bishop Macaila. Interesting, the son of the veil, Caila, Palia, being, that's what it means, of blessed memory. Seeing her heavenly desire and modesty, and seeing so great a love of chastity in this remarkable maiden, he placed the white veil and white garment over her venerable head. And that's exactly what happens in a velatio. The woman is dressed in white veil and garment. And you find that, as I say, elsewhere. And I just wanted to put this in, this amazing, fairly recent find. Speaking of Macaila, he's particularly associated with Croghan Hill, which is, I had that up at the beginning. Croghan Hill in County Offaly, Croghan Vriela, is a very important site, and Macaila is associated with Croghan Hill, as is Bridget. And here we have a beautiful wooden weaver's beater found in a bog near Lemanahan, County Westmeath, another very, very fine site. Anyone should go and visit it. And here we have an Ogham inscription. If you see it, it's kind of hard to see right at the top where they have marked it there. On this beater, simply saying, Bon Macaila, probably Bon Macaila, blessed is Macaila. Now this would date to possibly the 7th century, a little later, but it just shows that Macaila was genuine and was being prayed to in some way, somebody weaving. And I come back to that in a minute about the whole thing of weaving. Anyway, Cogitosis's descriptions of Brigid's miracles are really common to themes in saints' lives and reflect Irish society of the time, because we know that from the huge tracts of early Irish law, how society was structured and what the economy of society was. And when you compare that with some of the lives, you see society being described. But also we must remember that there are certain themes in all saints' lives that occur, and no more so than in Cogitosis's life. So we have things a lot about cows and milking and butter. She's good at turning water into beer, but then very specifically, Cogitosis has said, like what happened at Cana. And that is a miracle of Mary, remember, the request of Mary to Christ to change the water into wine. She ensures a good harvest. She has a lot to do with childbirth and dealing with women in childbirth. She is very much giving to the poor, alms, so she is for the lower orders in society, which from early Irish law did not have a good or easy time. She cures the sick, which you find with saints in general. And I must say about saints, sometimes we have the wrong impression of what a saint is at this period. We all think of saints canonized from the 12th century onwards, through process of canonization. If you read Peter Brown, the great Peter Brown, also a man who came from Dalkey, but one of the world-renowned historians now, who wrote about the cult of holy people, we're talking about something quite different. And, when we're talking about a move from one religion to another, all religions have holy people. So we're not talking about a Catholic canonized saint. We're talking about something quite different at this stage, of holy people who are seen to have certain powers during their lifetime, and especially after their death. She cures the sick, she feeds animals, she tames wild animals, and she also saves women from threatening situations. So women who don't want to be married, women who are being pursued by violent men, she protects them. So there's a very strong element of, the woman even in Cogitosis, who, shall I say, is the more orthodox of the writers of her life. So, for example, Bridget stayed with a poor woman who used her loom as fuel for the fire and cooked her only calf on the fire. And when the supper in God's honour was over, the night was passed in customary vigils. So Bridget is making them all pray. And when they got up the morning after, our hostess, who had lost her cow's calf, found with her cow another calf of the same kind. And she beheld the wood of the loom, which likewise had been restored. So, as you can see, this is the economy of women, the economic activities of women: milking, making butter, weaving. This is what you see in the law tracts and in other texts. So it is interesting that she is very much associated, first of all, with the poor and also with the activities, ordinary, day-to-day activities, nothing spectacular, of women. Now, when we come to the Vita Prima, we see a different kind of Bridget, or a different portrayal. There's quite a bit about her family. Her father, Dufdach of the Fort of Leinster. He's a nobleman. He's not a Christian, and there's no indication that he converted. On the other hand, Bricseach, she's from the other spectrum of society. She's a slave to Dufdach. He impregnates her, and you have this topos of his lawful wife being jealous of Bricseach because of the love that Dufdach has for her, and also that there has been a prophecy that Bridget will rule her sons and their descendants forever. So she doesn't like this at all. So she makes Dufdach sell Bridget to a poet, which is interesting in its own right, that it's to a poet that she's sold. And there is a note, there is a comment by in the Vita Prima which says that the latter, Dufdach, however, did not sell the offspring, Bridget, she had in her womb. So obviously Dufdach recognizes her as part of the family. She is not as lowly as her mother. She is brought in to the family. Now, her birth and childhood really follow the motifs of the great heroic biography as we have. You know, we have Cormac MacArt, the mythological king of Tara, we have Cuchulainn, and they're always portents. Somebody prophesies, in the case of Bridget and most of them, that before her birth, somebody recognizes that the child in the womb is going to be a special person. And of course, that happens in the case of Bridget. But that is what we have throughout the literature. It's an unusual birth because her mother, who's milking, trips on the threshold into the house, and one foot is inside and one foot is outside. And so you have this idea of the liminal birth, inside and outside. Again, you find that in heroic biographies. So it's interesting that Cogitosus doesn't have any of this, but the Vita Prima is aligning Bridget and her story to what is the traditional story of the birth of a heroine. Lots of fire motifs. And again, this is taken sometimes as an indication of, you know, a fire cult or something, which is very much based on what the 12th century Welsh cleric described in Kildare as, you know, that there was a fire, a perpetual fire at Kildare. That is interesting, but it is much, much later. The fire motif, again, you find it with saints' lives, and you find it in the heroic biographies. So the fact that, for example, a house goes on fire and the child is in it and she survives intact. You have that happening in other texts. There are signs of sanctity from the very beginning. So as I said, she's prophesied to be, as is Columba, as is Columbanus. And of course, there are early childhood miracles. The miracles are very similar to Cogitosus, but Patrick is also brought in. And unlike Patrick, who is kind of the heroic conqueror dealing with taking sides in, you know, royal battles and, you know, with against certain dynasties, she's more shown as a peacemaker, trying to get these violent brothers together, trying to avoid battles. this great kind of motif of they all go off to battle, they think they've beheaded their enemy, and they come back to Bridget, and it hasn't happened at all. It's like as if they dreamt that they did it, and, she says, well, actually, it didn't happen. The other side are still there, so make peace. And, of course, the preference for the poor. But you do have sort of potential reflections of an earlier non-Christian belief system. So, as Charlie said, we have to remember that, during our lifetime and later, Ireland is going through this period of conversion, which is a huge thing to happen in a society. You are moving from a different belief system, different rituals, different ceremonial ceremonies, into a new one, and into one that is coming from outside, and coming with it a new language, Latin, and literacy. So we have to remember that in the context of her life, if she lived in the late 5th, early 6th century, and even in the context of the lives, and particularly the Vita Prima. So, for example, this I take from the Vita Prima: the Holy Maiden felt a loathing for the Druid's food and used to vomit daily. Observing this, the Druid carefully investigated the cause of the nausea, and when he discovered it, said, I am unclean, but this girl is filled with the Holy Spirit. She can't endure my food. Thereupon he chose a white cow and set it aside for the girl, and a certain Christian woman, a very God-fearing virgin, used to milk the cow, and the girl used to drink the cow's milk and not vomit it up, as her stomach had been healed. Moreover, this Christian woman fostered the girl. Now, there's so much in this extract. First of all, Druids, whatever about the word that we translate into Druids, the old religion must have had men and women who were the custodians of the religious beliefs. In the Vita Prima, Druids are seen in a benign way, whereas in Murchu's life of Patrick, and even Tyrchan's notes on Patrick, Druids are to be knocked down, killed, turned into stone, all sorts of things like that. This doesn't happen with Bridget, which is quite interesting, that it takes another view of Druids. And these people, these custodians, as I'll show you in a while, they survived well, I think, into the 7th century. If Murchu is saying about Patrick saying to kings, don't listen to that lot, I'm going to turn them into stone, it means that they are still around, that they are causing a bit of trouble, or at least that kings are still listening to them. And now we come to the thing about food. The idea of clean and unclean foods. You find that, for example, very much in the life of Columba by Oddavnon, where some foods, and also in the Irish penitentials, where some foods are regarded, for example, dog, not to be eaten. Horse, liminal, some of them are cursed for eating horse. So here we have that topos or motif, and it's resolved by, I think, probably a non-Christian kind of motif. Because if we think of Bowen, the goddess of the river Boyne, it is Bowinde, the white cow. So here we have a very nice indication of accommodation between two belief systems that needed to happen. And of course, her foster mother is Christian. Now, the other thing that very much Christianizes this story, and that we can see, and I think I haven't been able to find another example so early, you have a lot of examples of this in late medieval period, is this idea of imitatio Mariae, so imitating Mary. And this comes through from the earliest period with Bridget. The Vita Prima says, then a holy man at the synod saw a vision in his sleep, and when he got up, he said, I have seen Mary and a certain man standing beside her, who said to me, this is Mary who has been dwelling among you. No sooner had the holy man related this at the synod than the widow accompanied by St. Bridget arrived on the scene, whereat the holy man said, "This is Mary whom I saw, for I clearly recognize her features." Thereupon they all glorified her as a type of Mary. And an old Irish genealogical poem, which is contemporary probably, 7th century, says it's to do with her people, the Fothart, and who their enemies and who their friends are, and what their place in the province of Leinster is. And in the middle of all this, it refers to Bridget and said, "She will be a second Mary, olive order, mother of the great Lord. If she calls upon him, he will enslave everyone who will not worship him." Again here, a message of conversion. And as I say, a very early example. You've got lots of saints like St. Clare and saints in the late medieval period who are regarded as saints who have this imitatio Mariae theme. But this is an early one, very early, and very interesting from the point of view, because after all, the cult of the Virgin Mary had only really got going as well in previous centuries. So that's how early it is. And I think I haven't quite worked out what is happening there. It needs to be looked at more closely. Now I come to the goddess question. And here is a wonderful dedication to Brigantia from Scotland, which is a small statue, well, not that small, with this inscription that is dedicated by a certain man, Amandus, who's an architectus, to the sacred Brigantia. What have we to say about Bridget and Brigantia and the Brigantes? Well, there are dedications to Brigantia in the territories of the Brigantes in northern Britain and southwestern Scotland. So you find inscriptions, and also you find statuettes of Brigantia, very much in the mould of Athena with her great helmet, not with many obvious Celtic or non-classical motifs in the statuettes. We don't have any in Ireland, of course, because we just don't have that archaeological culture, at least yet, found in Ireland. But the basic root of Bridget, Brigantia, Brigantes, Brig, indeed, you find saints all over Ireland called Brig, is simply Brig, Briga, a height. So, for example, the kingdom of where County Meath now is Brega, which means the hills, or the kingdom of the hills. And they are not necessarily related. So, for example, Bridget could have been a personal name that could have been in Ireland before and independent of Brigantia and the Brigantes. And the Brigantes may be a group in Ireland called the Ivaricha, who are around Ireland, like Bridget's people, the Fotharte. They're particularly, if you know, the baronies of Bargy and Forth in County Wexford is supposed to be Ivaricha and Fotharte. But Brigantia was also probably independent even of the Brigantes, whose own name probably means hill fort dwellers, so the Brig, the height, and that they later adopted Brigantia as a deity. So the evidence for Bridget as a goddess is quite slight. As you all know, the reference always referred to is from the Cormac's Glossary, which is a 9th to 10th century date, where he mentions the triple goddess of poets, craftsmen, and leeches. There's also a slight reference, and an interesting one actually, of a people called the Ivrichtain among the Dacia of West Waterford. And as I said, there's the question of all the saints, cults, the Kilbrides, the Kelvride, the Tubervride, and so on. and also the ones that are all across Britain and the continent. I think we have to look at them as individual cases, because, for example, the ones on the continent clearly come from a spread of Kildare missionaries. Well, I shouldn't call them missionaries, they're not really missionaries, but mainly men, all men, I think, coming from Kildare to places like Nivelles and Foss now in Belgium, to Cologne later on, so that the spread is very much in different periods. We have Anglo-Norman taking on St. Bridget. We have even the Vikings, so that you have a dedication to St. Bridget here in Dublin, and you have a dedication, for example, in Chester. So that it's a very complex, it's not just the one explanation, the whole question of place names. Now, this may be my solution, or at least the beginnings of a solution to the question of the goddess. In the Vita Prima, we have a few sections that are very, very interesting. St. Bridget had a pupil named Dar Luchtach, who, as she was not guarding her eyes one day, saw a certain man and desired him, and likewise he was enamored of her. So then one night the Virgin had a tryst with the man, and that night the Virgin was in the same bed as St. Bridget. Dar Luchtach is conflicted and fills her clogs with burning coals and plunges her feet into them. Then she extinguishes her passion and returns to her bed. And Bridget was observing this all the time. And of course, when she saw Dar Luchtach's feet, she healed them. Now, are we building up an alter ego here between Dar Luchtach and Bridget? And I think so. Because when you come to the death of Bridget and Dar Luchtach, the Vita Prima says, now when Bridget's departure from this world drew near, her protege, Dar Luchtach, wanted to leave this life with her. Bridget answered her, you will survive me by 1 year, and on the day of my death you will die, that we may have one feast day. And so it happened. Now, Charlie pointed out to me yesterday that this happens to a certain extent with Columba and his historic successor, Boethina. But I think there's more, or could be more, to the Bridget story. Because when you look at the name Dar Luchtach, or I should have there, Dar Luchtach, it means the daughter or the devotee of Luchid, a possible version of the god Luch, who is spread all over Ireland. He occurs in various forms in genealogies as the great ancestor. Professor Pádraig Ó Rian years ago linked him to saints like Malua, Malaga, and so on, and the veneration of Luch. And you wonder whether this is what we're talking about, that we have an alter ego, or a woman who is a devotee of Luch, who is in Kildare. And you do have this formation of saints, female saints with the element Dar, a daughter or devotee of, and normally the second element is a deity. You have it with men as well, with Mach, and either something like Macortin, the son of the rowan tree, something like that. And you have, for example, that name on Ogham inscriptions. So are we talking about the amalgamation of two forms of ceremony, and that Kildare is the crucial point here, and also the feast days? So the festival of Imbolg, which is supposed to have started on the beginning of February, they weren't following necessarily the Roman calendar, celebrated in Kildare at some former sanctuary prior to the foundation of the monastery. And it is really important that the 2nd of February is Candlemas, which is a feast of the purification of Mary. So on one hand, do we have 1st of February Dar Luchtach, 2nd of February Bridget. Dar Luchtach is not named as a successor. The first real historic abbess that we have is a very important woman called Gnáthad or Gnáthad. And she dies historically in 690, and indeed may have been in the background of Cogitosus and his life. Unbelievably, and I think I have to acknowledge this, and I have highlighted her name, Professor Julia Smith in Oxford has been trawling through this incredible treasury in the Abbey of St. Maurice d'Agon in Switzerland, where they have kept small little tags right back to, the 6th and 7th century of labels labeling the relics that they held. St. Maurice d'Agon was on the way to Rome, and obviously people going to Rome and coming back from Rome were dropping relics as a gift, presumably because they stayed there, and it became known as a place that collected relics. And Julia, when she was going through these parchment relics, found this tiny little fragment, and on it says Saint Bridget, so it's in the genitive, so obviously the relic of Der Luchtach, and the relic of her Bishop Conlaith. And on the basis of the script, it probably dates to around 700 AD. So here we have Der Luchtach in reality associated with Kildare. And in anyone who takes a photograph of this, I want you to make sure that Julia is acknowledged, because she's the person who found it, and the image from the monastery of St. Maurice. It's called the Monastery of St. Maurice because they had the relics of St. Maurice and his Theban legion. So that was the tradition. But I think this is such an important piece of evidence. Well, if we look at it from the archaeological point of view, why Kildare? Kildare is at the one end of the Curragh, which is as you see, this comes from the National Monument Service Historic Environment Viewer. It is covered with prehistoric archaeology. And indeed, an archaeology where you have still in use in the 5th and 6th centuries, when Bridget was supposed to be alive, or was alive. And a lot of these monuments are burial monuments. They're barrows and ring ditches, and the burials are happening right into the 6th century. So radiocarbon dating for some of the burials that have been excavated date to this period. And at the other end of the Curragh is Dunallinga, Knockgalling, County Kildare, which is the royal enclosure, ceremonial enclosure of the province of Leinster. And I mentioned Croghan Vriela, or Croghan Hill, another very important archaeological site. So are we seeing the build-up or the choice of Kildare as a place because it is part of this rich ceremonial landscape? It's close to the great royal site of Knockgalling. And also, and I won't go into this in huge detail, it is also in the lands of the Fothart, all these important places. So are Brigid's people in charge of these places? And our friend Dar Luchtach, that she's one end of the story of religion in Kildare, and Brigid is the actual historic beginning of a Christian foundation at Kildare. I had to do a lot of work on this, but it came to me when I was working on this paper. But of course, Cogitosus, he doesn't have any of that. He describes Kildare in this magnificent basilica and double monastery. Neither should one pass over in silence the miracle wrought in the repairing of the church, in which the glorious bodies of both, and remember, repairing of the church. So this is a later stage. This is not the church that Bridget would have founded, nor anything like it. The glorious bodies of both Archbishop Conlaith and our most flourishing Virgin Bridget are laid on the right and the left of the ornate altar and rest in tombs adorned with a refined profusion of gold, silver, gems, and precious stones, with gold and silver chandeliers hanging from above and different images presenting a variety of carvings and colours. Now, this passage from Cogitosus has been debated forever by scholars, whether it's real, a genuine description, or whether it's one that has some very ornate Anglo-Saxon or more likely late antique continental church that somebody has seen or they have seen as they've been travelling to Rome, which they have been during the 7th century. And we will never know because Kildare is covered by a cathedral of the later period, so it's unlikely. And if anything, it was in wood rather than in stone. Now, we do have the gold and the silver, as we know, of the period with ecclesiastical objects. So it's quite possible. And we probably have lost all our painting and frescoes that would have been on these wooden churches and possibly on, I think I picked out St. Cuthbert's coffin, which dates to the late 7th century. We may be talking about something like this, where carved on it are the 12 apostles, and they probably would have been painted and very colourfully. So this may be what Cogitosus is talking about. But it certainly wouldn't have been the church founded by Bridget in Kildare. So I come to an end. My conclusions are that Bridget was a historic figure who founded a female community, probably in the early 6th century, under the jurisdiction of a bishop, Conlaith. And interesting, Conlaith is not of her people, but he's of the people who are still in competition for the provincial kingship of Leinster. And that this foundation was in the model of a late antique double monastery. You find them in Gaul. Caesarius of Arles has one down in the south of France, where you have men and women under the jurisdiction of a bishop. We don't have evidence that she was a prominent goddess in early Ireland, but her alter ego, Dar Luchtach, or Der Luchtach, daughter or devotee of Luchid, hints, I think, at the pre-Christian nature of Kildare and Bridget's life. And we have to take into account the archaeology of Kildare and the Curragh, which suggests that this was a very important prehistoric landscape, and particularly funerary landscape. And there is some suggestion from the genealogies that very much this area was the custodians of this landscape were Bridget's people. And Bridget needs to be understood in the context of the process of conversion in Ireland in the 5th and 6th century. She was living through this process. It wasn't an all-conquering Patrick coming in and sweeping his way through Ireland. In fact, the evidence is that Christianity probably seeped into Ireland, especially through trading networks on the east coast of Ireland. And it is possible that, or probable, that Christianity caught a foothold in Ireland, in Leinster, in areas around Leinster, and that when the Pope sends Palladius to Ireland in 431, that probably the people he was coming to, who were the people who already believed in Christ, as is said, were in Leinster. So that's the background to her religious formation. She's straddling both. And as I said at the beginning, the sources really need to be read in their own particular contexts and what was happening in the background. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Well, that was an absolutely fascinating lecture, and as usual, full of insights and new ideas, which will have us think, certainly having me thinking for a while. Now, Adele has kindly agreed to take questions, and if anyone would like to ask a question of her, please feel free to do so. Yes, there's a lady up there. Adele, come to the bench.
Bridget was recorded, as you pointed out, written down about, but prior to Bridget of Kildare, was there a preceding kind of, not quite Christian, but spiritual centre in Kildare
Yes.
that would have existed for a long time before Bridget?
Yes, I'm beginning to think so, yes. Because, you know, this, when we look at it archaeologically, this is a very important area in Leinster. In fact, it's the core of Leinster. They even call it that. And anyone who wanted to become king of Leinster, even into the sort of 8th, 9th century, had to hold this area. And it wouldn't be surprising, given that and given the archaeology, that there was something at Kildare. And I'm not saying, and I know Charlie we've had a lot of debates about other elements of descriptions in Giraldus Cambrensis. I'm not saying that this may not be true about the fire. You just have to say it's written in the 12th century, so we don't know whether something like that would survive. But it is interesting that he says, you know, men can't, or if they do pass through the threshold, they're done for. Where he gets that from is interesting. But I think Charlie's argued for another motif in Giraldus being quite old, about the king of Kendall-Connell, is it? Kendall-Connell? Yeah, where when he's inaugurated, he sits in the broth of a horse. So that's pretty old, I think. So.
That certainly is old.
Yeah.
In one of your early slides, you were talking about the use of food and matters around food. There was the statement, the supper in God's honour. Am I hearing some echoes there, or could one hear echoes of Eucharist, or is that pushing things too much?
No. There's a very strong Eucharistic element. There has to be in that as well. Because clearly the Eucharist and the Mass is core, and especially in an Episcopal foundation. So, no, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, to read these, and I only touched on what's in the... To read these texts is like the stratigraphy of an archaeological dig. So you have theology, you have folk motifs, you have literary motifs. You know, you have very layered, very complex texts. And with Cogitosus, it is very much the orthodoxy, you know. And also the thing about it is it's a very well-written, stylish Latin, I think we could say about Cogitosus. So his name, Cogitosus, being smart fellow, is true when it comes to his writing. I mean, he has all this kind of prologue, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm not the person, I'm doing it for my masters or sort of my fellow people, but he certainly is able to write.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating. I was just interested in your comments on some of the associations of Bridget, particularly the nature associations like Kildare, the association with the oak trees, the association, as you mentioned, with taming wild animals, and I know some of her miracles involve some sort of control over the weather, where she brings down storms or she gets rid of storms and so on. And I'm just wondering, excuse me, if you think that's suggestive of a continuation from pre-Christian concerns with the natural world?
I suppose I wouldn't put it just like that, because you find this taming of wild animals and taming of nature in a lot of saints' lives. for example, Columba is always taming the wind when they're trying to get to Iona and there's a storm brewing up. And how I would look at it, I think there is a particular interest in nature and humans' association with nature in the Irish tradition from early on. But I'm not sure that it is unique. We have it in other, we have it in Welsh, we have it in Anglo-Saxon. So I wouldn't say that it's something that is, it's there. It's there. And the other thing we have to remember practically is that people had to live with nature in a very different way to how we do, you know. So there may be, for example, in the theme of the wolf or the wild boar, there were wolves and wild boars all over the place. They were presumably, you know, attacking, well, the wolves anyway, attacking cattle or sheep, which that was the coinage of the time. So I think there are these kind of messages there that we have to read on at a practical level in society. But that doesn't say that, you know, there is a particular interest in nature. It's just that it's elsewhere and it continues right through.
Thank you so much for a truly mind-blowing lecture, a fascinating new information, definitely for me. I actually have two questions. First one is about were there any historical sources indicating that St. Bridget also had influence over religious teaching in Ireland at time of her life? And the second question, I understand it's beyond the historical time that you covered in your lecture, but I'm curious to know what happened with the role of these abbess, above all abbesses, after the death of St. Bridget. How much longer after her that role lived?
Yes,
Thank you.
yeah. On the teaching, she isn't portrayed particularly as, you know, a big preacher. Not really. It is almost all by example. And I've wondered from the lives, particularly the Vita Prima, whether it is actually geared towards how you convert women, that there's an element there, because women are absolutely essential, I think, to conversion, because the religion a woman takes is likely to be the religion of her children. And also, noble women are shown very much as accepting Christianity where the spouse, the husband or the king doesn't, but then her son does. You have a lot of that there. So I think perhaps that this is, rather than being sort of all-conquering preacher, that it's a more gentle, different kind of conversion that she's involved in, and that would fit with, you know, what we know elsewhere, and indeed in Ireland, of how Christianity or a society converted to Christianity. On the second one, yes, the Abbess of Kildare is the most powerful woman in Ireland, really, to the 12th century, I think we can say. Interestingly, for up to, I think it's the 9th, 10th century, you have women from the Fussert, from her people, being abbesses of Kildare, even though, you know, in politics their power has gone, and perhaps even their power of being in charge or custodians of this ceremonial landscape has diminished. But they still keep their hand in there. And then quite often you will find afterwards, you will find women who are the sisters or the daughters of competing kings for the provincial kingship becoming abbesses of Kildare. But there's one beautiful example in, I think it's 909, when Muireann, who is the abbess of Kildare, they have this king of Munster incarcerated in Kildare. He's a prisoner. He's lost a battle. And they negotiate, the Leinster men negotiate with the Munster men to release him, but under certain conditions. And she leads a procession of the clerics and important people of Kildare, and they're sort of waving their relics and making noise, processing through the countryside to the border of Munster, where he then is handed over back to his people. So she is that important. I mean, she's symbolically important, but also politically important as well.
Every Irish child learns in primary school about St. Bridget's cloak and how she claimed land for her monastery using it. So is, where did that come from? Was that added on much later, or is there any
No, it's not. We have a text on the Battle of Alluin, the Hill of Allen, which dates to the 10th century, and we have an earlier poem as well, which is probably 8th or 9th century, where she hovers over the Leinster men to protect them in battle. Now again, you have Columba doing the same for his people, the Ine. And you have, I can't remember, was it Martin of Tours or one of those continental saints where they hover over. So it's an early motif, yeah, it's an early motif. I think Christina. Tim.
Idel, would you mind saying something more about the alter ego, this notion of the pre-Christian, the Christian? It's fascinating. Anything more you might say?
About the
alter ego?
Oh, the cogitosus description?
The whole notion.
Oh, alter ego. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Christine, sorry. Well, yes, it's an idea. It came out of the fact that I was looking at the formation of the personal names of female saints' lives. And we had, what's her name, Gnáhad or Gnáhnad, that nod thing, which I think is the equivalent of the on, like Colmán, a feminine equivalent. So it's a diminutive and it's a sign of a Christian. And then there's a clutch of saints, both men and women, but the women are particularly interesting, with this dar, which means, as I said, devotee or daughter of. And they're kind of daráine, so the daughter, dar Erke, the daughter devotee of Erk. And their fathers are not Erk and Luchtach and so on, but most of the names, and there's even a dar Oma, which may be Ogam. So most of the names suggest that they are religious in some way, but a harking back to, I'm not going to say priestess, it's not that, a minder of a sanctuary of some sort. And I think perhaps Dar Luchtach is this. Now the alter ego, I still have to work into, because as I said, Charlie mentioned, that Baithina, Columba's successor, there's a similar motif there, and that Baithina's feast day, I think, is supposed to be the same as Columba's. But as we were discussing it this morning, we were just thinking, well, maybe this is a motif that evolves from having to move somewhere like Kildare from Dar Luchtach's devotion to Bridget, and that she could have been a historic person herself as well, because there must have been some woman who was the last one, to tend or to be the custodian of whatever was there, and then Bridget is the next, or that Bridget is all in the one, It's just something that struck me when I was looking at the personal names.
Any other questions at all? Oh, one more here.
so many questions, but I'm going to hold to one question. You'd made reference to Bridget of being like the second Mary, Mary whispering to Jesus about turning the water into wine. I've never heard of the story of the water being turned into beer, and I'd just love to hear that.
Yes, well, I think this is quite a common motif in saints' lives, but it is interesting because, of course, beer was, the Irish produced a lot of beer at the time, and the interesting thing about beer is that, for example, there's a poem, I think it's 8th century, where somebody's very cynically saying to the abbot of Kildare, and I didn't mention the abbot of Kildare, there are abbots of Kildare, well, he belongs to a royal family, and whoever's written this sarcastic verse says, well, do you really rule, the ale of Cooloo, which is this area, Cooloo? So in other words, it was a sign of power as well, of being able to hold a territory that produced this particular ale. So again, as I said about the texts and all the different layers, you have the layer of Cana and, Mary, but you also you have an economic one because, ale was an important element of society, and you probably have this power thing as well happening.
I'd like to give a lake of beer to God. I'd love the heavenly hosts to be tippling there for all eternity. I'd love the men of heaven to live with me, to dance and sing. If they wanted, I'd put at their disposal vats of suffering. White cups of love I'd offer to every man. Sweet pictures of mercy I'd offer with a heart and a half. Now, I'd make heaven a cheerful spot because the happy heart is true. Because the happy heart is true. I'd make the men contented for their own sake. And I'd like Jesus to love me too. I'd gather the people of heaven from all the parishes around. I'd give a special welcome to the women, the 3 Marys of great renown. I'd sit with the men, the women of God, there by the lake of beer. We'd be drinking good health forever. And do you know, every drop would be a prayer. Amen.
Thank you, Noreen, for that. And I'd like to thank Adele for a wonderful lecture this morning, thought-provoking, insightful as usual. So we go away from here, certainly I do, with quite a few problems to think about. But that's really what it's all about, and that's what makes it important. So Adele, thank you very much again. Thank you.